The map function is very helpful because it allows us to apply a function to multiple elements in an iterable. So if you have a list of numbers, you can apply one function to each number in the list. So we're going to take a look at what map exactly does. Then we're going to use it with lists, tuples, and sets. Next, we're going to look at built-in functions and that we can also use map with these built-in functions. After that, we're going to have a map function that takes multiple iterators. And finally, we're going to use the map function with lambda functions. So what exactly does the map function in Python actually do? Let me introduce the concept of the map function by using a simple example first. So over here we have a simple set of numbers 1 through 6. And there's nothing special about these numbers. All we want to do is we want to square each of these individual numbers from the set. So we want to square them. And the way we do this is within a for loop. So we're taking an individual number in the numbers list. Then we have defined a variable x, which is simply the square of an individual number. And then we are appending this x to the results list, which we created up here earlier. And finally, we are printing out our result. So if I go ahead and execute this, then the result should not surprise you. You can see down below that I am getting all the numbers from the initial numbers list squared. So the 1 we had earlier becomes the 1 now, then the 2 became the 4, which I've just gone over with my pen with, the 3 becomes the 9, and so on and so on and so on. So you can see that worked like a charm. But there is another way to do this in a simpler way, and that is using the map functionality. So how can we do exactly the same thing that we just did using map? Because after all, map allows us to execute a function on an iterable, such as a list, and it then applies the function to each individual element of the iterable. So over here I've defined another function called square, and it returns the number that we input squared. And when we want to use map, the first argument needs to be the function that we want to apply to all the elements, and afterwards we want to input all the individual iterables. So in this case we only have one. We could have multiple, we'll see that later on, but here we're only using one. So here we have the numbers squared saved, and afterwards we're printing them in the data type list. So let's go ahead and execute this. And you can see further down below that I have the desired result again over here, which is all the individual numbers from the numbers array squared. And one thing that you should pay attention to is that I have over here specified the data type explicitly before printing it. If I had not done that, so if I had left that out and simply printed out the result of this over here that I've highlighted in blue, you will see that we simply get the map object returned. And so that is a bit unlegible. You don't really want that. So you always need to make sure that you turn the map object into some sort of data type that you can read. So that doesn't necessarily need to be the list. It can also be a tuple. So let me write tuple in here and execute it again. So if I have the tuple and execute it, you see I get it as a tuple. I can also have it as a set and execute it again. And now this is a set because we have these curly brackets. All right, so that's the concept of map. Let's move on. Now I want to show you that we can actually use map with different data types of the iterable. So as long as what we're inputting into the maps function is an iterable, it should work. I have 3 examples over here. So the first one over here is a simple list, as you can see from these square brackets. Then next up is a tuple down here, a tuple which has these rounded brackets. And finally, we have these curly brackets, which is a set. So we have these three different examples, and they all have the numbers 1 through to 6. I've also defined a function which simply doubles the number that we input. Over here you can see we're returning n times 2, so we're doubling the result. And then I have added the map function over here 3 times, and I have done so for each of the individual containers. So for the very first one over here, which is a list, I have used the list. Then for the tuple, I have used the tuple. And finally, for the set, I have used the set, as you can also see from the individual names that I have input over here. And so after that, we saw earlier that it is not enough to print the individual result outcome. So it's not enough to simply set a print statement around these things, because all we get is the object. So over here, we're going to see that we retrieve the objects. But after that, we'll be able to see that we can convert the map object back into a list, tuple, or a set. So let's go ahead and run this code. But before I run it in its entirety, let me just run it up to the objects. So over here, you can now see in the console output that I have retrieved 3 map objects, which corresponds to the 3 map objects we've created here. But let me get rid of those, and let me now get the individual lists, tuples, and sets. So let me go ahead and execute all of this. And now what you can see is that we have retrieved exactly the result that we wanted to, because of course you can see that we have doubled all the numbers in the iterable. So initially we had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, and we had it for a list, tuple, and a set. And now we have 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. So this function was applied correctly to our iterable. Now, one thing that I want to show you still, and that might be something which you have already asked yourself, is in my example, you can see that I have created a list, for example. I've created a list, then I have put it into the map function over here. And subsequently, I took that list and then converted it back into a list. But can I, for example, take the initial list and turn it into something else? Yes, sure you can. I mean, let me briefly show you that you can, for example, turn this into a tuple. So if I go ahead and execute all of this now, hold on, you can see that I now have a tuple because we have rounded brackets. But I can also turn it into a set. So as long as we have a map object, and you can see down here now that it's a set. So as long as we retrieve a map object, which is exactly what we're retrieving here for these individual containers, we can then convert it into anything else from that map object. Surely enough, you can also use the map function on built-in functions. So to just briefly demonstrate that, over here you can see that I have another numbers list, and I have a couple of negative numbers mixed in with some positive numbers that are over here. So let's say we want to retrieve some absolute values. So we want to turn the -2 into a 2, and we want to turn the -5 into a 5, and the rest remains the same. Then we can do that quite simply by adding the map function, then putting the function into the map as an argument. And this abs over here, which stands for absolute, is simply a built-in function. It's built into Python. And you can see that if I take it as an argument over here, as the first argument, and then also input the list of numbers over here, then I can go ahead and print the values out, and it will give us the value that we desire. So let me execute this, and you can see that we have actually applied the absolute function to the numbers list, because now we have all the absolute values in the list. And surely enough, this does not only work for the built-in function absolute. If we take another built-in function, such as the length function, which returns the length of a string, we can have a words list. So over here we have the sentence, "How are you doing today?" And let's say we want to retrieve the number of characters in each of these individual words. So we expect to get a 3 here, a 3 here, a 3 here, a 3, 5 here, and a 5 here, because that corresponds to the number of letters in each individual word. So then we can go ahead and execute this, and you'll see that this will also work just as fine. This is exactly the result we expected: 33355, 33355. So built-in functions are also compatible with the map function. Now it's going to get a bit more interesting, because we can actually use map with multiple iterators. So what does that mean? So if we have the map function, we have in the previous examples always had a function, and we have then had one iterator. So I'm going to write iterator 1. But that does not necessarily need to be the case. We can also have multiple iterators. So there can be a second, there can be a third, and so on and so forth. So to demonstrate this in an example, I have now got two lists. I have beginning and end. And if you look closely at these lists, you will see that if we concatenate them, so if we put them together, they give us some colors. So if we take BL and UE, we have blue. If we have GR and EEN, we have green, and RE and D is red. So now we have then got a function which concatenates the two strings. So we have one string argument, another string argument, and we are returning a string which is simply the addition of both the strings we input. And if we now use the map function to do this job for us, so the way we would do it is we would take map, we would then add the function that we want to apply to each element in each of these individual two lists that we have at the top. So I have input the first list and the last list with the beginning and ending of each word. And subsequently, we have then on this part over here got the map object. And then we are taking the map object and converting it into a list. And that is exactly what we're printing out. So if I go ahead and show you the result, so let's go ahead and execute all of this, you can see that down below in the console output, I am getting the concatenated list of colors as I wanted. So that goes to show that you can have multiple iterators with the map function. Moving on to the last thing that I want to show you concerning maps, I want to show you that you can also use lambda functions with maps. So if you don't know what a lambda function is, don't worry, I'm going to explain that briefly as well. So over here we have a very simple example of a squared function. It's actually the one that we saw at the beginning of this section. And we have over here the numbers list with numbers 1 through to 6. And we have the squared function, which simply returns the squared of the input parameter. And what we're doing here is we have the function square, and we are applying it to all the numbers in the numbers list. So clearly, if I go ahead and execute this, you will see that we get the numbers squared. That is no surprise. But how could we do this in an even simpler way using a lambda function? One way to do that would be to, let me show you, do it this way. So over here we have what we had earlier in 3 lines in 1 line. We have the lambda function over here, which simply is a function that has no formal definition. And over here you can see that we have this parameter and we are then squaring it. So in the first argument of the map function, over here we have, instead of adding an explicit function as we had before, added an anonymous lambda function. And we're applying this lambda function to all the numbers in the numbers list over here at the top, well, set more specifically. And if I go ahead and run this now, you'll see that the result is exactly the same. So we are still squaring each number in the numbers set. And that is how you use lambda functions with map.